This program is brought to you by Teachers College, Columbia University. Please visit us online at itunes.tc.columbia.edu.
And on behalf of President Susan Furman, I want to welcome you to Teachers College and to this evening's U.S. Constitution Day Forum entitled Marriage Equity in New York State. The program, co-sponsored with TC's Offices of Diversity and Community Affairs, Government Relations, and our student organization, Queer TC, provides an update on the status of same-sex marriage in New York State. The struggle in New York is part of the national and leading civil rights effort in our country to extend marriage and benefit rights to everyone. I want to extend a very special and warm welcome to our esteemed panelists, the Honorable Daniel O'Donnell, New York State Assembly member for the 69th Assembly District, which includes Manhattan Valley, Morningside Heights, and the Upper West Side. He is the first openly gay man in the New York State Assembly. He is a leading voice in this civil rights movement and is the sponsor of the same-sex marriage bill in the Assembly. Although she's not with us yet, I want to say a special welcome to the Honorable Christine Quinn, our New York City Council Speaker. She is the first woman, openly gay and Irish speaker, who has worked extensively on issues of justice and equality, and is also a leading voice in the fight for marriage equality. We want to welcome our Columbia colleague, Professor Jeffrey Lax, an assistant professor in Columbia's Department of Political Science. Among his research interests, he studies the responsiveness to public opinion and the effects of public opinion on the civil rights of gays and lesbians. He has a recent publication with Professor Justin Phillips in the American Political Science Review entitled Gay Rights in the States, Public Opinion and Policy Responsiveness. And a special welcome to Susan Sommer. She is the Director of Constitutional Litigation and Special Counsel and Senior Counsel at Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund. As you know, that's the nation's oldest and largest organization advocating for the civil rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and those living with HIV. She was the lead counsel in Hernandez against Robles, which sought the right to marry in New York, and argued this case in the New York Court of Appeals, which, as you know, is the state's highest court. She leads Lambda's litigation, defending recognition of out-of-state marriages for New York same-sex couples, and she will argue 2 marriage recognition cases in October in the Court of Appeals. So we're thrilled that you're here, because I don't know why you're not home preparing for your arguments. Before we begin, I want to say a quick word about Constitution Day. For those of you who may be unaware, September 17th is U.S. Constitution Day. Senator Robert Byrd, a West Virginia Democrat, believed that American students lack significant knowledge regarding the U.S. Constitution. Thus, in December of 2004, Senator Byrd offered an amendment that was passed by the House and the Senate. The legislation requires that all educational institutions that receive federal funds implement educational programs relating to the Constitution on September 17th of each year. This date was selected for celebration because on this date in 1787, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met for the very last time to sign our United States Constitution and presented it to the American people. Very quickly, the Department of Ed is charged with overseeing this legislation, and they intentionally left the implementation language vague. So with no specific curriculum or interpretation required, academic institutions are free to provide a wide array of programming. Now, on to our panel. Assemblymember O'Donnell will speak first. Next will be Professor Lax, and Susan Sommer, and Speaker Quinn. We want the audience to engage in a conversation with the panel, and everyone is invited afterwards to the reception in the trustee room in 109 Zankel, right around the corner. These programs could not be put together without the help of all of our colleagues. And I want to say just a quick thank you to Matt Camp, who's the Director for Government Relations, Michael Weinberg in Queer TC, Media Services, and Culinart, and of course in my office, Lenore Caro and Jolene Lane, and our graduate assistants. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Teachers College for inviting me here tonight. This is part of my assembly district. I go all the way up to 125th Street and down to 85th Street. And I represent what I feel is the finest place in the world. I have a district that is 1/3 black, 1/3 Latino, 1/3 white. The whites are primarily Jews, and they elected an openly gay Irish Catholic guy. You have to love America, right? Okay. So when I got to the assembly in 2003, I joined Deborah Glick as the gay caucus. She had been there since 1991, and she was very lonely. And I was thrilled to have someone there to mentor me and to explain how to get things done. My partner and I have been together next month for 29 years, which is an awfully long time, since that's probably more than most of you have been alive in this room. So that's a long time. And when the marriage discussion, when I got to the assembly, there was already a marriage bill pending. Dick Gottfried, who represents Chelsea, had a marriage bill introduced, but it was going nowhere. It was never discussed. It was not really part of the discussion at the time. And then I want to thank Suzanne and Lambda for taking the lead in what they've done in creating a strategy to figure out how to move this issue forward. I was in my first term, and my dear friend Robbie Kaplan, who is a partner at Paul Weiss, was one of the lawyers involved in this effort, and called me and said, "You should be one of the plaintiffs." And so you know, even though I represent this wonderful neighborhood, every political advisor I had said, "Don't do that. You have enough work to do. You don't want to make yourself the face of this very, at times, polarizing issue." And this is something I've never said publicly before. I got an email from my sister. My sister used to have a little talk show, and she's kind of well known. And so she sent me an email, and in the email she said it was very brief. She writes in haiku, in case you haven't figured that out yet. And so she wrote me this very brief email that said that she understood that I was being discussed for playing this role, and that she wanted me to do this. And she said, you know, I know we're O'Donnell's, but you can be a Kennedy too. And I thought about that, and my partner was very complacent, willing to do whatever I wanted to do. And I said to Robbie, I didn't think we were the right plaintiffs. And you know what I'll say about this is I'm an attorney as well, and I was, you know, I'm a trial lawyer, I'm not an appellate lawyer, I was a public defender in Brooklyn for 7 years. And so I'm good with juries, but not so good with judges. So I said I didn't think we were the right plaintiffs, and Rosa Parks was not the first black woman to sit down on a bus, right? I mean, the question of who is the leading person for that is not an accidental thing. And Robbie, God bless her, convinced me that I was wrong, that I was the right plaintiff. And this is how naive I was. When we filed the lawsuit, there was a press conference that I thought nobody was coming to. Okay, and I arrived at this place where there was, you know, international news crews. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was like, there were 120 trucks parked outside of where this was. And it never sort of struck me at the time that it was going to get that kind of attention. Okay, so we moved forward. There were a bunch of cases, they were consolidated. They ended up in the Court of Appeals. It was brilliantly argued. I was there. I was convinced that we were going to win. So my partner and I are driving home from Albany, and he says to me, when we have our wedding, which of your colleagues have to be invited to the wedding? So I thought about that, and I listed about 10 of them at the time. And we didn't win. Judge Kaye's dissent is brilliant. Judge Kaye's dissent is essentially what the Iowa court found subsequently. In my opinion, it's legally right on the money, and it says exactly what needs to be said. So the Court of Appeals said, you have to go to the legislature. I'm like, oh, wait, I'm one of those people. I know how to do that. So we got a new governor, Elliot Spitzer, for those of you who don't remember him. He was governor for a short time. And he sent what is called a programming bill to the Assembly and the Senate. And the way that works is the bill says at the request of Governor Elliot Spitzer. But before he did that, a number of us, Dick Gottfried, Tom Duane, Deborah Glick, and I, sat with the counsel's office to come up with a newly worded bill. And one of the most important things that we demanded and got in that bill was a specific clause that said that no one who, a person who, of faith, a person of a religious order, is not required to marry anyone. Because the other side has been saying, you're trying to force my priest, rabbi, minister, whatever, to marry people, which is not what this does. And so we made sure, and that was the one major change in the legislation from the version that Mr. Gottfried had and the version that the governor introduced. And so the way this works is the bills get sent upstairs. Second floor is the governor's office. The third floor in Albany is the legislative offices to the two houses. And the people who run those houses decide what happens to that bill. So in the Senate, it was controlled at that time by Republicans. Joe Bruno sent it to the Rules Committee, which is just like sending it to its death. And Shelley Silver, to his credit, let me carry this bill. And I say to his credit because I'm fairly certain that he understood exactly what I was about to try to do. So that year, all I did was marriage. And this is what I did. I sat down with Deborah, and we went through the entire list. And the first thing we did was try to get co-sponsors. The beginning of that year, we had 24 supporters for marriage. And so I knew that we needed to have a lot of names on that bill in order to send the message that we were moving in the right direction. And so I used every power and skill that I had to get as many names on the bill. So what do I mean by that? I flirted with some of my colleagues. I threatened some of my colleagues. I told them how happy the gays will be if their name was on the bill. And the threatening part was interesting because what I ended up saying, which probably got me about 10 more people, I went to a number of people who I know have aspirations for higher office. And I sat down with them in front of others, because I didn't want this to not be witnessed, and said, if your name is not on this list, and you're running for higher office against someone whose name is on the list, then don't even come talk to me. I can't help you. And I know that some of them didn't like that. They thought it was hardball, and I went to them and said, I don't think this is hardball. This is just the political reality. This is personal. This is about my life issue. And if you're not willing to put your name on that bill and you run against somebody who was willing to do that, that person will always have my support before you will. And there's nothing I can do about that. So when we introduced the bill, we had, I think, 59 sponsors. So we went from 24 to 59 in about 6 weeks. That is unheard of in Albany, unheard of. So you need 76 votes to pass a bill. Okay, so then I sat down with Deborah and created a communication strategy where every single week my colleagues got a letter from me. And I alternated from the personal to the political to the policy. So I sort of did a cycle. So I would talk about, I would include in all of the letters, John and I thank you for considering this bill. So let me say something which is quasi-critical of my colleagues in government who are openly gay. When I arrived in Albany, it was clear to me that if I wanted to have an impact on this subject, that I had to bring my partner to everything and have my colleagues know him. They had to come to my house to dinner. They had to perceive us to be in a relationship like them. And nothing is wrong with not doing that, but neither Tom Duane nor Deborah Glick really did that. They didn't bring their other halves to these political events the way I knew that so I brought John to everything. Now, it's very useful that he's tall, thin, and good-looking. It is very helpful, okay? And he came to Albany in the end when the vote was coming, you know, and I sent him out. And you should see these little old ladies melt when he comes over and he knows who they are. And I mean, it's really rather stunning. But the truth was that I knew that if I wanted my colleagues to say that my relationship was equal to theirs, they had to see it that way. And one of my colleagues said to me one night, what do you do? What is the last thing you do at night before you go to bed? I said, I call John. And he said, well, then you are married. I said, well, then why can't I have a piece of paper? He said, you got me. So John was very much a part of this in terms of that. So all these communications made reference to John and I in these communications. And much of it, this wasn't rocket science, but there was some things. So let me give you what they were. I didn't get this. Evan Wolfson, who's a brilliant strategist, got a letter from Mildred Loving. Mildred Loving was the woman in Loving v. Virginia who was arrested in her own bed for having crossed racial lines when she married. She married a white man. She was an African and Native American woman, and she wrote a letter saying people should be able to marry who they like. So one week, all my colleagues got, hey, do you know Mildred Loving? Look what she has to say. I, at the time, had a staffer who had worked in California. We, the New York State Assembly, became the third legislative body in America that passed this bill without a court order to do so. The first two were the Assembly and Senate in California, vetoed by Mr. Schwarzenegger. And I said, I need to find someone who changed their mind in California. And there was a woman, Gloria McLeod something, Latino woman, Roman Catholic, who was a member of the California Assembly, voted no the first time, changed her vote to a yes vote, and then the following year she ran for the Senate against someone who voted no, and she won. And so she was very nice when I talked to her. She let us write the letter. So we wrote a letter that she agreed to sign that sort of said, this is not the third rail, this is the right thing to do. As a grandmother, this is the right thing. I managed to move up to the state Senate even though I took this vote. So that accomplished the political end. And here's a factoid that I use. I get invited now to speak all over the country. I went to Richmond and I just came back from Maine. Not one single state legislator who voted for marriage equality has ever lost their seat, ever. Not one. That is not true for the other side. And so, politicians are weak people. They don't like to be out. They're like celebrities. They're pack animals. They don't want to be out on their own. They want to be with everybody. And they live in fear. And their fear is they're going to lose their seat. So that piece of information that no one has ever lost is a very important thing in trying to get politicians to understand that, in fact, they should not fear being on our side. And so the speaker he speaks somewhat Talmudically. So he never actually says what I'm about to say he conveyed to me. But it was clear to me that if I went out and got 76 votes, the bill was coming to the floor. So what happens on the day of the vote? We have 75 votes. We have 75 Democratic votes. And he called me into his office and says, Danny, this is your choice. Do you trust your vote count? Do you trust your 75? And the two Republicans who told you they're voting yes, are you sure they're not going to change their mind? And one of them was Teresa Sayward, a North Country Adirondack woman whose son is gay, who I've met. And he and his partner have been together for 20 years, and they have kids and blah, blah, blah. And I said, there's no way that Teresa Sayward is voting no. And so he said, all right, well, then we'll put it on the floor. Now, so then we had this debate. We went and we, put the bill on the floor, and I had to defend the bill. And here's the amazing thing that sort of shocks and disappoints me. The most hostile vitriol did not come from Republicans. It came from fellow Democrats. And I think that one of the reasons that that was the case in 2007 was because of Teresa Sayward, because she had made it clear that she was not going to take that kind of stuff from her colleagues. And so I had to debate the bill. As I said, I brought John up and brought him on the floor and sent him over to a few people. I've now promised those people I won't mention their names in public, but the reason I mentioned about the wedding was after we lost the case in the Court of Appeals, I went to one of my colleagues and told him that story. And I said, you know, you were one of the people who would be invited to my wedding. And he said, well, Danny, I'd be happy to come to your wedding. I said, yes, but how do I invite you to a wedding that you don't think I'm entitled to have? He went white. And I said, I'm just trying to figure out what to do because, you know, it's kind of embarrassing and really sort of wrong that I have to ask you for the right to get married. And John came up on the, and this was one of the 5 people I said, go talk to so-and-so, and he did. And so in the end, we got 85 votes. The debate wielded us 85 votes, which is a unheard of transformation, because we had 24 votes in April, and we had 85 votes in June. Now, at the time, we knew that the Senate was controlled by Republicans, and nothing was happening with that, and so we knew we'd have to do it again. The other thing is that, you know, we run for re-election in even years, 2, 4, 6, 8, so it's generally easier to pass this kind of legislation in non-election years. And so I knew that by passing it in 07, if the Senate didn't act, we wouldn't have to take it up in 08. So fast forward, we have a new governor. We have a new program bill. The governor, thankfully, this time holds a press conference and says, this is a priority of mine. I attended that press conference. And that bill was sent to us this year, 09, and we passed it in 4 weeks, which we would have passed it in 3 weeks, but there was a funeral of a former senator, so we couldn't do that. But I mean, it was a miraculously quick-paced thing, and this time we got 89 votes. So we are moving in the right direction in terms of where things are. The problem has been and is the state Senate. Thank God I'm not here for a forum on the problems in the state Senate, because I could be here for hours. No one knows who's in control. No one knows who runs the thing. No one knows who to negotiate with. It was my understanding and expectation that this bill was coming to the floor this session. That's what Malcolm Smith had promised. Dean Scalos, the Republican leader, had promised that it was a vote of conscience and that they were going to allow each individual member to vote as they wished. Then there was a coup. The whole thing came crumbling down. It's still not functioning, the Senate. It is my understanding that sometime in October, this bill is going to come to the floor of the state Senate, and we will see what will happen. In terms of what can be done between now and then, obviously write to, if you have an assembly member who voted yes, other than me, don't bother sending me a letter. Send them a letter thanking her or him that they did that. If you have a state senator, you should send them a letter telling them that you want this to be done and that you expect them to vote yes. And if you live here in New York City, in Manhattan, where all of our electeds are in favor of it, I would ask you to go through your Rolodex or whatever the electronic version thereof is these days and find people who don't live here. And I told this story about 3 months ago, and this absolutely gorgeous 24-year-old man came up to me and said to me, what am I supposed to do? I live in Chelsea. I said, well, where does your family live? He said, well, my mother lives in Garden City. I said, well, get your mother to write a letter to her state senator saying that she wants him to vote for this bill. And, you know, I say that a lot, and I rarely get much response. Well, his mother wrote, without a doubt, the most beautiful, moving letter I've ever read. She knew everything about the state senator. She was a kindergarten teacher who taught catechism, and her son went to the same high school as the state senator. And it was just so moving in reading her plea to this senator that I'm sure that if he votes yes, it's because of that letter. And people think that politicians don't listen to this. I know exactly what comes into my office. I know exactly how many communications. People do respond to individual constituent, requests. And so that's what needs to happen. I have been involved with the lobbying organizations about trying to make sure that we round up the votes, but essentially, you really can't rely on anyone in the Senate telling you that they're going to do something actually means that. And so that's a very frustrating place for me. I'm turned 49 in November, and I've said all over the world that by the time I'm 50, I'm going to be a happily married man, and I intend to make that so. I would hope that that would happen soon. But in the end, if it doesn't happen in this election cycle, we'll start again in the next election cycle and, make sure that we elect equality-friendly legislators to do what they're supposed to do. And so I thank you once again for inviting me. I will stay in here the rest of the panelists, who I'm sure have a lot to share, and I will be around if you want to ask me questions or tell me what to do. I'd be happy to talk to all of you. Thank you very much.
I must admit, I'm used to sort of hiding away in my office and doing my work. Usually when it's 4 in the morning and some statistical simulation finishes running, or I solve a mathematical proof or something, I don't quite get this turnout, and the Associated Press does not come. So it's kind of, not complaining, it's okay. But it's kind of nice to be doing something that I get to talk about to an audience like this. And the way I see my role here tonight is to, well, my screen has actually shut off, so I'm going to look at the slides with you, but that's fine. The way I see my role here tonight is to put the battle within New York State in a somewhat larger context to the best of my ability given the work I've been doing. And this is part of some ongoing work with my colleague Justin Phillips, looking at how much public opinion affects state policymaking. Okay, and in particular, policymaking on the rights of gays and lesbians. Now, to some extent, our big question is, does democracy work? How well do public opinion majorities get what they want? How much does opinion matter, the opinion of the people, as opposed to just the elected elites? We elect people who are going to represent us, but they do so indirectly. So how much does public opinion really matter? Now, we know in political science land that overall policy tends to move in the right direction. The more liberal opinion is, the more liberal policy is. The more conservative opinion is, the more conservative policy is. But that's sort of an on-average story. In general, that's the case. What about specific policies? How well does policy actually represent opinion? And in particular, how well do these things occur for gay and lesbian rights? And that's what we're trying to do. Now, there's a bit of a challenge, in particular to us as researchers. We don't have a lot of data. We've lacked any way previous to now to really analyze policymaking at the state level with a really fine microscope. We have national polls on whether people support various policies that are relevant to the daily lives of gays and lesbians, from same-sex marriage to more mundane issues, one might think, such as health benefits or employment non-discrimination, job non-discrimination, housing non-discrimination. But to really figure out how much public opinion matters, what we needed to figure out was opinion, public support for each of these in each state. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, but what we were able to do is sort of a recent advance in statistics and political science on public opinion, which allows us to get at these state-level public opinion estimates. That's why this research was simply not possible a few years ago. Using national data, using census data, and the technical name for this is multi-level regression and post-stratification. We like to call it Mr. P. If you don't find that as funny as we do around the office, then I have the right job, and I'm sure you do too. So for the first time, we can get these really specific estimates for public opinion. And this is opening up a lot of exciting research questions. And this is the one that we've been working on the hardest. And we now can look at these individual policies. Okay. So we have a bunch of questions. That we're now studying. First, what is the support? We just want to know what the level of support is for these policies. And there are some surprises here, even before we get into how much of an effect public opinion has. Does public opinion actually affect policy on these different issues? And do the policies actually match what the majorities want? And these are actually two slightly different issues. You can imagine some extra support helping you pass a gay right policy, but it's quite possible that you need to get to 80% support to get that policy anyway. Or it could be that even 30% support is enough to get you there. So just responding to public opinion isn't the same thing as the majority getting what it wants, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Okay, related to that question is there a liberal or conservative bias in such policymaking? I think we've all seen the stories about liberal elites are forcing this down the throats of lots of people, and even Justice Scalia has talked about the homosexual, is something leaking here? I hear a hiss. Just don't yell out, you lie, and I don't really care about the rest of your outbursts. So one question is there a liberal or conservative bias in these policies? And then, of course, what other factors affect this type of policymaking? State institutions, such as whether there's a really professional set of legislatures, whether the courts are elected, the amount of media attention. Do these factors matter at all? So these are the questions I'm going to sketch answers to now. And I'm very happy to take questions later. I should have put my email address up on the slide, but please come talk to me if you want any of the details behind this. I want to start by telling you what we've found for public support for these policies in New York State. So for each of these policies, I've shown you the level of support, whether New York State has the policy, and to give you some context, the level of support averaged across all 50 states. And what you'll see is that New York is certainly more supportive than the average state, and for a lot of the policies has very large levels of support. You can see that the mean support for a lot of these policies might be much higher than you think. Certainly, we were surprised to see that support for housing and employment non-discrimination was so high. And in fact, I think, I don't have my paper in my hand right now, but in all but 2 states, there are majorities that support these types of protections. Yet only 20 to 22 states have these protections. So there's a definite gap between support and having the policy. It's not that there is a lack of support and that's why they don't have policy. Support's actually really high for some of these policies. Now, in New York State, 63% seem to explicitly support civil unions, and I'm counting people who say they don't know as the rest, as saying no. So this is really only people who explicitly support it out of all the people in the state. It would be even higher if I left out the don't knows or I refuse to answer. But even for same-sex marriage, support is over that 50% mark, and you're going to see that that's actually a very pivotal point for same-sex marriage policymaking. Okay. So what do we find are the biggest influences on policymaking on these issues? The most important we actually find is public opinion. It actually has a huge effect, more than voter ideology, more than the ideology of the elected state officials like the governor and state representatives. We do find that salience matters quite a bit. How visible the issue is, the particular policy is, in press coverage. That's the way we measure it. But what we hope to be getting at is how important, how much visibility this particular policy has. It won't surprise you. There's a lot of attention given to same-sex marriage and very little attention given to issues such as housing and job non-discrimination, which actually have been fought for much longer. But they're really not on the media's radar in quite the same way, in part because it's possible some civil rights groups have actually decided to go below the radar in fighting for that, thinking that elites might be on their side. We actually suggest a different conclusion. Raising salience can be a good thing. We do find that religious interest groups and religious conservative voters have more influence than their population share would suggest. That these are also good predictors as to whether states have these pro-gay policies. That there is, after you control for preferences and ideology and partisanship, that the number of evangelical and Mormon voters and whether or not there's a powerful religious interest group, a conservative interest group, these things matter even beyond those direct influences. Elected officials, as I said, have a relatively weak influence once you control for all those others are a thing, once you set those things aside, which is to say it's not been elite-driven in our findings. And finally, we don't find in this project any particular institutional effects, that some state legislatures have converted opinion into policy more or less than others. We have some different conclusions and a different set of policies, but here that's what we find. Okay. So if you'll pardon this picture, I just want you to see one thing. The relationship we find between opinion and policy exists across all the issues we study. Sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker. And what you should see here is you see support for the policy on the bottom and vertically, it's the probability of the state having the policy. And you can see that this line is steep, and it should be steep if you see responsiveness to public opinion. But there's something else going on here that we hadn't even thought to look for until we started this project. And you'll see there's a red crosshair in the middle of each one. Well, if the majority matters, then that line should go through the center. Because when you have less than 50%, you shouldn't have the policy. And when you have more than 50%, you should definitely have the policy. So this line should be very steep and go through that center point. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't for all the policies, and it does for some. For marriage, it does go through that center point, but for housing and jobs, it's shifted to the right. Now, what does that mean? It means you have to get to a supermajority to get to any reasonable chance of having those policies. That's a conservative bias in the policy. You need more than a majority to get them, not just a majority. And I'll explain why that's so. In this picture, we again have support for different gay rights policies on the bottom. And vertically, we have the salience of the policy. So remember what I said, marriage is, really right near there at the top, and job and housing protection is near the bottom. The darker the shading, the more likely it is the state has the policy. So how do you get a pro-gay rights policy? You have to have support, and you also have to have higher salience. Okay? When those two work together, when you have both of those, you get the pro-gay rights policy. But notice what happens when salience is low. When salience is low, you have to get to a really high level of support to get to that dark region. But if salience is very high, if visibility of the policy is high, like for marriage, you get there almost at the 50% point. So this explains that sort of puzzle as to why you see these supermajorities and yet don't have the pro-gay rights policy. Public visibility of these lesser issues, and I'm definitely putting lesser in quotes because I don't think they're lesser in terms of people's daily lives. When you have lower levels of salience, it takes a much larger majority to get you there. There's another way of looking at this. Let's ask ourselves, when do majorities get what they want? And I'll pause for the switch. When do majorities get what they want? Well, the dark area is when a majority gets what they want. So on the right is when you have a majority in favor of a pro-gay rights policy. And that's the story I just told you. To get to the majority's position, you have to have high salience and high support. When do conservative majorities tend to get their way? Well, that entire rectangle is filled in. Basically, if there's a conservative majority, they're almost certain to get what they want. This suggests that there's not there's not a liberal bias in such policymaking relative to what the people actually want. There's actually a liberal bias because conservative majorities get their way, and liberal majorities only get their way when salience is also high. Okay. None of the policies we studied showed a liberal bias. A lot of them show this conservative bias, in particular the ones I've flagged here, such as employment and housing, health benefits, hate crimes protection. Even when there's a very large supermajority, this can be the case. Okay. To give you just some specifics, here is same-sex marriage and civil unions opinion in each of the 50 states. The red dots are for same-sex marriage, and the blue are for civil unions. And you'll see that once you cross that 50% mark in the middle, that's when states tend to get same-sex marriage, with Iowa being an exception, I suppose. And for civil unions, you actually seem to have to get to a much higher level of support to get there. Now, I think part of that is that a lot of states are no longer considering civil unions. They really are taking on the same-sex marriage fight directly. But you'll certainly see it's not the case that there's a lot of filled-in red dots to the left of the 50% line. This is not something that's happened crammed down the voters' throats. This is something that the voters have tended to support. And just two last messages. One is looking at the change over time. The blue dots are roughly where opinion was in 1994, 1996. The little gray dots that are hard to see in the middle are where opinion was in 2004. And then I've shown you where opinion is now, to the best of our ability to say so. And that's the red dots to the right. A couple of messages. Notice that the states at the very top, the ones that started with very high levels of support, have actually moved more than the ones at the bottom. It's not that the more conservative states caught up. The liberal states have increased far faster than the conservative states. And the states have actually moved further apart, therefore. Another thing to note is I've tried to show you the movement over time, and I'll just sum it up for you quickly. The change that's occurred over the last 12 years, about half of it has occurred in the last 4. So there are ups and downs across states. I will ignore you. I'm very good at doing that. So about half of the movement has occurred more recently, which suggests that there's this increasing rate of support. Now, there's some movements up and down over time that I'm not going to spend time on, but that's one of the things we were interested to see. I called this looking back, and now I want to end on looking ahead. We break down support in each state by each of the 4 age cohorts. We have 18 to 29-year-olds, 30 to 44-year-olds, 45 to 64-year-olds, and 65 years and older. And as you can expect, the older you are, the more likely you are to not support same-sex marriage. Okay. But what do I want to draw your attention to here? In all but 12 states, if I'm counting this correctly, a majority of the youngest cohort actually supports same-sex marriage. If they controlled policymaking, we'd have same-sex marriage in all but 12 states. And if majority policy were to hold among 65-year-olds and older, we would not have same-sex marriage in any state. So there's definitely a generational difference here. Now, one question is, has the change we've seen over time, the previous slide, has this change over time been because people changed their minds, or just because of younger voters coming into the voting pool and older voters, shall we say, leaving the voting pool, which is my new preferred euphemism for, well, you know. And what we found is that if you look to see where 18 to 29-year-olds were 12 years ago, they're roughly where the 30 to 45-year-olds are today, almost exactly. Well, you know what? Those are the same groups of people once you add 12 years. So it seems to us that far more of the change over time has been because of generational replacement as opposed to people changing their minds. There might be some evidence because states do move up and down. And this is true for the other age cohorts as well, that they seem to be, the age cohort here, as they move up and become this new one, they are actually more liberal, but it's not that people change their minds. It's just they've moved into a new age cohort. I'm going to end there, but I'm very happy to take questions later. And I'll just put this picture up as I walk back to my seat. This just plots opinion for each of the estimates. And the filled-in dots show you the states that have the policies. So it gives you some sense as to where these are. Thank you.
Guarantee the rights of minorities even before we get to that red cross on these charts. And that is really what was going on in a legal and philosophical and moral sense when we brought the Hernandez case and the companion case that Assemblymember O'Donnell so beautifully represented as a plaintiff. We have these core constitutional rights that should mean that Assemblymember O'Donnell never has to go to another person in our state legislature and say, will you vote for my rights? We have them as a matter of basic entitlement. Unfortunately, the New York Court of Appeals didn't agree yet when we brought our case, but we were arguing that as a matter of state constitutional law, there is a fundamentally protected right to marry the person of your choice, and that you can't discriminate or dole out that right based on the sexual orientation or sex of the partners, or frankly, where public opinion polls may direct. But we're not so naive as to think there is no connection or no other route through public opinion. And I think a lot of what that marriage litigation was trying to do was two things. One, let's just win outright. We have that right, we should. But even if we lose, we can do something, to quote Evan Wolfson, brilliant sort of leader in the freedom to marry, is we can lose forward. We can bring salience, if I understand the term. We will bring tremendous public attention to this issue through the litigation, through the bristling room of cameras that came to our press conferences, to the argument in the case. And we can move in the legislature in ways that were not possible just a year or two prior to the litigation. You know, I was also I was standing way in the back behind you and you at the press conference when Governor Patterson introduced his bill. And I have to say that it was, you know, it's a great feeling to know that at this point now you've got your governor supporting the right to marry, and that in fact even there was sort of talk in the press and the blogs around that time that the governor was seeing this as a way of garnering more public support to support the gay people. I mean, this is a real transformation in, I think, our political scene and culture, but one that was reflecting the reality that in New York there is an ever-growing support for the right to marry. But I think it's really important for people to know, and I'm going to get sort of lawyer wonky now, that we actually do have marriage for same-sex couples in New York. We have it because New York, at least to date, recognizes the out-of-state marriages of same-sex couples. And we have, over the years since marriage first became available in Canada, Massachusetts, had large numbers of New Yorkers who have been crossing the borders, marrying in other jurisdictions, and returning to the state as married and standing up for their marriages and saying, we deserve to be recognized here as married, just as, you know, anybody would who goes to, you know, Montreal to get married and comes back because they like Montreal and come back, any kind of couple, heterosexual, whatever. We have had a series of cases. First of all, it actually turned out that there were many ways in which there was just voluntary respect being offered to these marriages, and increasingly by local and state governments. And the opposition to that respect was actually, frankly, coming from a very small cohort, if I'm using a term correctly, represented actually by out-of-state right-wing Counsel who have a self-proclaimed agenda of opposing the homosexual agenda. And there are a series of cases brought to challenge the respect that was being given by our governor, by state agencies, by Westchester County, and in case after case, we were winning. And I'm very proud to actually have a couple here who are parties, they're a same-sex couple, my clients. Yes. We have Robert Voorhees and Michael Sabatino. Who in many ways represent the way that same-sex couples are really pioneers, particularly in a state like New York. They did go to Canada and came back married and have firmly, passionately believed in their marriage, and we have as well, and the courts have as well. We are now at a stage where October 13th, these cases, there are two now that are combined, this case and one that challenges a state-level policy of respecting marriages for purposes of providing spousal health coverage to the spouses of public employees. And these two cases are going to our High Court, the New York Court of Appeals. I'll be arguing those cases. You're right, I should probably be home preparing, but again, another wonderful development and shift in history is I will be arguing shoulder to shoulder on the side, joining together in that argument with lawyers for the government, not opposing them as we were in the Hernandez case. I will be arguing with a lawyer from the State Attorney General's office who is representing the state government, and a lawyer from the Westchester County Attorney's Office who will be representing the County of Westchester. And I will be very proud to be shoulder to shoulder on the side of our government and the majority, finally, in this case. We've also had tremendous support in this lawsuit from what's called amici, from friends of the court who file on our behalf, ranging from the state bar, the city bar, lots of groups that have shown support for the legal principles and for the rightness of this cause. Now, I also think people may be wondering, well, what does it mean to come back and be married in New York this way? First of all, it does not, I think, and I think that my clients would agree, necessarily feel like, nor is it any substitute for, the right to marry here in your home state. You should not have to leave New York, go to Connecticut, Vermont, Massachusetts, a very growing number of jurisdictions, including 4 right along our borders, in order to, in a sense, sort of elope and come back here saying, we are married, that's not right. But once you do come back here, you deserve to be treated as married. And right now, what our state government, as a result of its very firm support for this right to have your marriage respected, it means a lot, actually. It can mean quite a bit. It does mean that you get insurance coverage for your spouse, especially if you're a public employee, and from many, many private employers. It gets a little complicated, and I can answer questions later or privately about that. It now means that if you are a married lesbian couple and you've conceived your child using donor, an anonymous donor, which is the way many families are typically formed in the community, when you deliver your baby in the hospital, you fill out forms, and the birth certificate for your baby will come back reflecting both of you as parents, just as it would for any other couple. I will add that we still strongly suggest and advise people to go ahead and do a second parent adoption. The non-biologically related parent must do that. And part of the reason is because New York, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have all these other states that not only do they not allow people to marry, but they won't respect them at all. And we have our federal government, which I hope shortly will change its positions on this, but also doesn't respect these marriages. They do respect an adoption decree, but they won't necessarily respect the idea that you're a parent because children born into a married couple are deemed the parent of both. And that is a way in which I think that same-sex couples in New York, especially, but all over this country, are really pioneers. We're on a frontier. Lawyers, we are very busy. I know that I've got a lot of job security. There's just a ton of legal issues that I'm sorry that you have to navigate, or that this community has to navigate, but we need these pioneers to work through these things. There are many other ways that being married out of state matters in New York, and we have a handout that can tell you more. I'd like to just turn now to you and what, in preparing for tonight's event and thinking about it, I already have seen your data. I've read a lot of it, and we've long known, actually, that younger people are far more supportive of the right to marry for same-sex couples and of other civil rights for lesbian and gay people. I wish my 12-year-old, could join that pool of voters and all of her friends, because I actually my job would be obsolete at that point. But I feel like the heart of the civil rights movement in many ways is at places like this that educate people to go and educate others, and to work especially with this younger generation. It is no secret that those on the right who oppose rights for lesbian and gay people often use children, focus on children issues to try to spark and galvanize galvanize a movement against. And we saw this in California after there was this victory in the California Supreme Court, and there's a case in which the Constitution of that state was held by the state's highest court to guarantee fundamental rights for same-sex couples. And it didn't require a majority of the people to go along with that. But California has an extremely easy, it's crazy, method for getting amendments done to the Constitution. It's like, you know, turning on your TV and it's gone. And unfortunately, there was a big push to amend the state constitution in Prop 8, which a lot of you probably heard of, and some of you may have also heard of these TV commercials that were quite effective, unfortunately, in California, where a child would come home from school and say to their mother, you know what my teacher taught me today? My teacher taught me, it's a little girl, that I can marry another girl. And this was meant to alarm and frighten, these fear-mongering tactics. And just think about it. Think about it. What are we going to teach our children in school? I feel like where children are concerned and where education is concerned carries so much power in this dialogue. And frankly, the right wing knows that. And they use that. And it's also no surprise or no secret that many of the years ago, and even sometimes to this day, historically, attacks have been launched when it comes to trying to stop or slow down the gay rights movement on school teachers, right? Decades ago in California, there was another proposition to prohibit lesbian and gay teachers from teaching in schools. And again, I feel like in some ways it is no accident that so much of this movement actually does galvanize around teachers, students, teachers and children. And it is because we know that it is the young people who are getting this. And they are getting it partly because another piece of data and statistic, one of the most powerful ways that people's opinions are shaped around these issues is if they know an openly gay person. That is one of the most, or single most effective ways of shifting people's opinion, which is why, you know, people on this panel have done so much to be publicly the faces of the private lives that matter so much. So, you know, part of the issue is when children are being taught and see openly gay and lesbian people and understand this is no big deal. This is my teacher. This is my friend. This is my friend's parent. You know, this is my assembly member, my council president. So much of the fear and the lack of understanding melts away. So, you know, to sort of take it home here, I want to sort of leave you with those thoughts. I feel like there is a tremendous amount of power actually in this room, you know, to influence through education and just through who people are, and to increase that, you know, shift in those red dots towards that right position, which actually oddly, maybe, I don't know if you thought about like it should really go towards the left. So with that, I will be utterly eclipsed now.
Well, actually, Susan, with that very comprehensive presentation, I was regretting my decision at having let you go first. So first, let me thank Janice for asking me to be part of the panel tonight and everybody for putting it together. And I know I won't repeat any flowchart data because that's not my forte when I was in school or since. So, but I hope I don't repeat anything that Danny said. You know, when I think about, and I think about it a lot because I get asked about it a lot and because it's a very important issue, marriage equality in New York State and where we're at. You know, and the answer to that question, Danny might agree with this, is either really soon or I don't know, from a legislative perspective. Would you agree, Danny?
Yes.
Yes. So, very scientific. But, you know, when I think about where we're at, and I think, you know, Jeffrey was certainly right, and Susan, about the generational issue. But I actually see, based a lot on the end part of what Susan just said, tremendous hope and opportunity in all different generations. I have to say the phrase generational replacement's freaking me out a little bit, but I think there is real hope there. And I think the entire progress that marriage equality and LGBT issues have had in this city, state, and country are based on 2 or 3 very simple but yet not easy things. One, deciding and then becoming a well-organized community. What's inherent in that, though, is then coming out and being visible where you live and where you work, which is not always easy. If you look at Queens County, in 1990, Julio Rivera was beaten to death in an anti-gay hate crime there that took a year at least, to get the police department to say it wasn't a drug deal gone bad, it was a hate crime. And then eventually to get that case prosecuted as a hate crime. Now, when a hate crime happens in Queens, one that is basically identifiable as one, immediately the police department recognizes it as such, meet with the community, work with the community. That didn't happen overnight. That happened because a lot of people in Queens in the early 90s took an enormous risk and said, we're openly LGBT people and we live here. They weren't just gay when they were in the Village or in Chelsea, they were gay at home in Queens. That has changed the entire dynamic in Queens. And on Tuesday, we saw 2 openly gay men get elected to the city council from Queens. That happened because people took a huge risk and came out at home and at work, not just came out in their social lives. So the only way we get organized, which is a key part of this, is to come out and be visible. And then the third part is to not just come out and be visible, but to do what kind of Susan said, the unpleasant thing of making your private life part of your public work, whether that's in your life as educators, elected officials, your extracurricular time as activists, or whatever. Recently the Staten Island Advance, which is the daily paper on Staten Island, which is spelled Advance, but in Staten Island it said Advance. It's just one of those other different things about Staten Island. Did a story about my relationship with Jimmy Otto, who is the Republican conservative minority leader of the city council. And the article was about this odd couple of friends and allies. And in the article, we both said, lots of different things about the evolution of our friendship, but in it, Jimmy said, made a joke about, the things we had in common. We were hotheads, we were micromanagers, we were obsessed with our jobs, and we both fell in love with women named Kim. Now, a bigger problem for him is I want to marry my Kim. He's a conflicted, tortured bachelor, so he's worried more about gay marriage than the fact it's going to cause him more pressure because more people around him are going to get married. But in the article, he says this. A couple days later, he tells me he goes to drop his dog off with his parents who live on Staten Island, which he does on a regular basis, which is dysfunctional, but that's another situation for Jimmy. But his mother says, I love the article about you and Chris Quinn. And he said, really? Well, and she said, yes. And that part about both of you falling in love with women named Kim was just lovely. Now, this is a 70-something-year-old Italian Catholic Republican conservative on Staten Island. I've never met her, but she knows her son. And her son calls me one of his best friends. So even indirectly, I think you can make an impact on all types of ages of people. But you only do that when you decide you're going to be really out and do what is, and I think Danny would agree, a not pleasant thing to talk about your private life semi-obsessively to people. When I went in to see Senator Flanagan from Suffolk, in that meeting, I think there were a couple of things that were happening. One, he was looking at a person who, holds a position some say is, the second most powerful political position in the city of New York. And he's looking at the person who is a member of a community who parts of him, and certainly big parts of his Republican Party in Suffolk, would tell you that community is a liability. And he's looking at that person knowing being a member of that community was not a liability. He's looking at that person knowing that person only got this job because Queens County Democratic Club, not a bastion of progressivity in its past, supported her. And thinking, well, maybe my political calculus is off because he's an elected official but a politician, so he's thinking about politics. He's thinking about that. He's also looking at me, and we're talking as people who both were raised as Irish Catholic kids who went to Catholic school on Long Island. And having a conversation about that. That is incredibly, and he's having this conversation after he had met with 6 people from Comac, Danny's hometown, where he did ask me what was in the water in Comac.
We're all wondering that, Christine, yes.
All of whom came to meet with him as openly LGBT Comacites, one of whom he had known for 15 years in different ways in the community and never knew she was a lesbian. And he kept referencing her. He said, don't you think that's odd? I knew her for 15 years and I had no idea. And whether that was odd or not wasn't the point, but she's in his head. You know what I mean? She's stuck with him. This woman who he knows and respects because she's, you know, a member of the Block Association or whatever it is. You know, it's in his mind. That's turning point. And when all of us have conversations with whoever the straight folks who could be allies are, who we are similar to, it makes them stop and think twice. So ultimately, I think the future possibilities here are all about those personal connections. You know, when I went to meet with Senator Honorado from Queens, I brought him a letter from this lovely gay couple who had adopted these beautiful twins. And the article was all about their life in Sunnyside as parents. That's almost impossible for somebody to disregard. So I will just say one last thing about the meeting with Senator Flanagan. I did get perhaps a little manipulative. What are you gonna do? And I did say that I'd like to get married before mine and Kim's fathers, who were each 83, died. You know, if you're meeting with a Catholic, you gotta go for guilt. Make that's a very important note. Works with Jewish people, other religions too. Anybody religious, go for the guilt. But in sum, I think there's a lot of moving pieces to this. Susan and the legal work are critically important to moving things forward and creating a sense for people that this is what is legally correct. It eliminates an obstacle that gets put forth by legislators. But the most important part of all of this are individual people telling their elected officials and their leaders their personal stories. Not just in the abstract, but in the really specific. You know, the most poignant letter I think I've ever seen about marriage was from a gay man in Queens who has a heart condition. And he doesn't worry, he said, most about having a heart attack. He worries most about when he has the heart attack, if he's going to be conscious to explain who his partner is. I mean, you can't really, unless you are just a horrible person, and then you're ungettable, argue with that. But it is gut-wrenching to have to tell that story. So I thank all of you for being here tonight and being willing to be part of the effort of people and stories that have to get told, because that's what's going to really eventually move everything forward. And and I just want to put a plug in for, on October 11th, the March on Washington, because that is a place through visibly, however many people are there, where stories will be told, and if folk are interested in going, my LGBT liaison, Eric, is in the back, and he can figure out a bus or whatever for folks. But thank you all for coming.
The preceding program was brought to you by Teachers College, Columbia University. Please visit us online at itunes.tc.columbia.edu.